but often wonder if there's a way out. You can't afford to quit, and you gotta know there's more to life if you would see through all doubt. So get up and boogie down, let your feet get off the ground. Come on and sing it loud. We are the party people. Troubles that keep you where you are. They hold you tight and press you down. There's only one way to stick around. Welcome to let it go and lay back. Just take it nice and slow. Ease your head. Can't fight the feeling, so lose your mind. Oh, slipping away in the dreams while we dance. Don't you worry, no, keep on trying. Pull out the crayons, yeah, deep inside.
Hey guys, welcome back to What's Your Story. This is the second episode, and today I have with me Professor Emanuelle Burton. Hi Professor, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good as well. Let's get straight into it. How did you get into teaching here at UIC? What do you teach?
So right now I teach ethics for the computer science department at UIC. That is not what I thought I would do with my life. My PhD is in religion and literature, which is not really a field. There's basically one program in religion and literature. It's at the University of Chicago Divinity School, which is a very large and very intellectually diverse program for the study of religion. And so I'd majored in English in college. I had sort of worked out during my final year of study, first of all, that I wanted to go to graduate school. Secondly, that probably an English department was not going to be the best home for me, even though I wanted to study literature. So I found my way to the University of Chicago. I spent 12 years there, which is a little longer than average, but not really a lot longer. It's a long PhD. And I graduated in 2014 without a thought in my mind of doing anything like what I'm doing now. I had spent the last 5 or 6 years teaching a lot of introductory humanities core type courses, mostly at the University of Chicago, but also some other places as well. And they sort of literature heavy, but not exactly what you would call English department courses, focused on the central questions of humanistic studies. So what does it mean to be a person? What are sort of major points of commonality and difference between us and others, both in a sort of an individual sense and in an historical sense, right? In what ways are our lives fundamentally the same as those of people who lived in a very different time or place?
Right.
In what ways are they meaningfully different? How do we come to be the people we are? To what extent do we have control over the people that we turn into? What does it mean to connect to another person? What does it mean to know another person? How do we know any of the things we know? Those kinds of questions.
Right.
So, and I taught a lot of literature courses because I think literature is a great way to think about the human condition. It is at once very engaging and intimate, and then also, I think, not personal in a useful way, right? Lots and lots of people can have their own relationships to Dorothea Brooke, who's the protagonist of Middlemarch, which is a novel you should read. It's very long, but it's worth it. Right, and people can have all kinds of different relationships to Dorothea Brooke or any other character in literature, but it's not quite the same as having yourself under the microscope, right? She can be a common ground and sort of a safely externalized place to nonetheless work through some very trenchant questions of personal significance. So that was what I thought I would do for the rest of my life, or I hoped I would do for the rest of my life. There are not a lot of jobs teaching literature or teaching religion. And then I was invited very, very accidentally. I met a computer scientist and was invited to collaborate with her on a single workshop paper with her and then a former graduate student of hers. and they were computer scientists, and they were writing about using science fiction to teach ethics. And that seemed fine. As like a little side project, I had written a dissertation on moral person making in the Chronicles of Narnia. So these were certainly questions that were proximate to me. I hadn't written on science fiction, but I was interested in science fiction, broadly speaking. I felt generally qualified to think about the sort of meaning making in science fiction. So we wrote this one paper, and I was like, great, that was fun. And then they were like, do you want to write a second paper? And I was like, yeah, I can write a second paper, I guess. It's not like I have so much else going on. I cannot give you an exact chronicle of how we got from A to B to F to Z, if Z is where we are, but how we got to now. What did happen along the way is that we applied for and got an NSF grant to begin work on a textbook, an integrated textbook anthology, which would have both teachable short science fiction stories and then also an ethics textbook for computer science that I think... It doesn't rely on science fiction in a super direct, obvious way. Like, we don't talk about specific works of fiction in the textbook, but I think you, as someone who's taking class with me, would recognize that the textbook material is informed by an approach to ethics that is itself informed by literature, right? The idea that
Definitely.
That abstract principles are only going to get you so far, that ethics is in the living. And literature is a useful way to think about ethiks because it is about people living, right?
That's actually a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, we're almost done with the textbook. It's the manuscript is due to MIT Press at the end of the summer. It's mostly done. So that's one thing that spiraled out of this project, and then the other is that my collaborator, the one who initially recruited me, after I'd moved back to Chicago, I'd left the city for a while. She said, one of my good friends is chair of the computer science department at UIC, and they have this ethics class. I think he'd be interested in having you teach for them. Do you want to meet him? And I said, that would be great. I thought a job would be nice. And so I met Professor Bob Sloan. And after the meeting, I thought, oh, well, he didn't like me very much. That's too bad. This could have been fun. But I was wrong. He did like me. Or else he liked me enough to hire me for this job. And this is my life now. And I wouldn't want it any other way. But, oh, my gosh, it's not what I planned.
So was the ethics course already there before you came in, or? There
was an ethics course. It was not mine. So 377 began actually at Professor Sloan. From what I should learn the history of this better than I have it. But different people will tell you slightly different things. And given my interest in sort of human storytelling, I'm not particularly interested in finding out what really happened. I kind of love the fact that 3 or 4 different people will give me 3 or 4 different versions of the history. I find that delightful. But it started between 10 and 15 years ago. I think Professor Sloan was instrumental in starting it. I know when Professor Sloan taught it, it leaned heavily into sort of legal questions, which is absolutely, I think, a respectable and plausible direction in which to take an ethics course. It's not the part that's necessarily the most compelling to me. Right. I've benefited hugely, right, from the fact that Maury Nyberg, the intellectual property lawyer who guest lectured for us, she's able to come in and carry that weight for me, which is great because it's essential. It's also, it doesn't really align with my goals for the course. Not that I'd want to exclude it, just that sort of in my sense of what it is I want to accomplish, that is not central. So I'm really grateful to have someone else come in, do that in a really thorough, responsible way, better than I ever could. And then I can be like, great, now we're going to go back to the work of introspection and thinking about moral perception.
I think CS 377 is a very unique course in the curriculum. And I'm certain that not a lot of computer science curriculum has a course like 377 in other colleges and other universities.
One thing that this is maybe a little inelegant to talk about, but I do feel like it's necessary to name. A lot of the institutions that have courses like this are frankly the very, very wealthy courses. Places that have, tuition of $50,000, $60,000 a year, right? Where when a student is paying that much, the student-faculty ratio is different. There are a lot of small courses, right? So those students at those schools probably have a lot of very small courses where they are asked to reflect and there is intensive interaction with a particular instructor. I absolutely do not say this to denigrate UIC. If anything, it's the opposite. I think UIC is really to be commended for stretching its resources to invest in its students in this way and offer them something that doesn't match the standard mathematics of education at public universities. It's something a lot of people get at very, very elite schools, which I mean financially more than in terms of merit, because they pay for it. And I wish it were more widely available. And I think that's what's really amazing about having this class at UIC.
Right. Because as you said, there's about 6 sections and about 40 students in each class?
30.
So that's quite a lot of students for one semester. And I think it's really good that we have this course as a required course in the CS curriculum.
I'm really glad you think so.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those courses which is not technical at all, but it's really important for someone who wants to get into the industry and create softwares and create technologies that's going to affect millions of people. So I think personally one thing that the course really helped me with was thinking about others, in the sense that if I create something that's going to affect them, to what extent is it going to affect them, and what are the complications that can arise if I do release like a software or a technology that's going to affect people. So I think that way it really changed my thinking. The other thing that I think that's really good in the the other thing that I think is really good that happened with me by taking the course was, like, I think it gave me a new outlook on how I should approach a particular problem. You know, it was something unique and something really cool to know that, you know, people actually think about how something should be approached, and there's these ethical theories or these ethical viewpoints that people kind of stick towards.
Yeah, I think one of the perils of our sort of modern thought moment of in the age of the scientific method, which, like, I'm very pro science, I'm very pro the scientific method, but I think no matter what kind of thought culture we live in, there are always going to be sort of weak spots or vulnerabilities to certain kinds of mistakes that are built into them. And I think one of the vulnerabilities that comes with living in a scientific age is that, I mean, of course there are people who are hostile to science, but I think the scientific worldview can overlook or underestimate the power and the significance of things that are not measurable by the metrics of science, right? I mean, I'm a religion scholar. It doesn't mean that I am pro-religion as such, but it means that I think religion is a significant and meaningful part of human experience. And, you know, sometimes people will say, oh, well, you know, I'm not religious because I believe in science or I believe in logic. And I think that's a mistake. And that's you're going to miss a lot of what people are up to if you think that. But the reason I'm saying this in response, though, just to sort of wind this back around, I'm sorry, I'm not very direct when I talk, which is maybe fine for class because it's my classroom and I can do what I want to an extent, but a little less great for a podcast. But the reason that I bring this up now is I think that a lot of people assume that if you cannot quantify certain kinds of questions or the sort of the criteria that we use to think about or analyze or the things that we are observing, if you cannot analyze or quantify those in a scientific way, that they're not real, that they're not substantial, that there aren't better and worse ways of talking about them. And of course that's not true. Right. I mean, the history of ethics is, in a sense, the history of people trying to get good at thinking about what's going on. And I think that one of the ways in which the course can be a breath of fresh air for a lot of people is that a lot of people are like, I kind of feel like there are meaningful ways to be better or worse at thinking about these things, even though I don't have a language of measurement for it. Or the languages of measurement that I have don't seem to translate to this very well.
Right.
I think that this is why so many people identify when they start the course as utilitarian, not just because utilitarianism is the kind of part of the epistemological backbone of the present, and maybe in particular built into computer science, but also because utilitarianism is the closest that gets us to quantifying things, right? And if we feel like the only way to be responsible and rigorous is to quantify things in a scientific way, then utilitarianism is the only responsible option. Of course, now you know that it's not.
That's exactly what happened with me, actually.
Yeah.
Because I feel as a computer science major, you're always doing something with numbers or quantities or logic and something related to that. And as you said, utilitarianism is the closest thing that comes to quantifying a particular solution to something. Right.
So, and I don't want to knock utilitarianism, right?
It is valid.
Commitment.
That's right. It's definitely a very valid viewpoint to take. But I think like after doing the course, I feel like when you taught utilitarianism, which was the first thing that we basically discussed in the course, I was kind of leaning towards that. And then when I studied deontology with you, I was kind of leaning towards that. And then in the end, it was virtue ethics, and then I was leaning towards that. But I mean,
so you're a virtue ethicist because I taught it last.
Well, actually, I'm more of a deontological person, I would say now, because when I think back about the course, I think that is what resonated with me the most. But I can definitely see how someone who's getting into ethics, or someone who's never taken an ethics course before, or someone who basically has no idea about the ethical viewpoints, can actually take up or relate to utilitarianism more than the others.
I'm glad to hear that each of them felt compelling when I was talking about them, because I want each of them to feel plausible, and it sounds to me like you really took each of them on as a way of thinking. Out of curiosity, do you think it was a good idea to start with utilitarianism? I do it on purpose because I figure that's the one that feels familiar to people.
Personally, I think starting with utilitarianism is something that can help people relate to what we're talking about in the course.
I showed up at the end of my first semester, poor Professor Sloan, and I was like, I have a great idea. I know what we should do. We should have 2 ethics classes. We should have one at freshman year and another one senior year. And he was like, look, we are already so far beyond every one of our peer institutions in dedicating one class. You know what we don't require? We don't require artificial intelligence. We cannot require a second ethics class. And I was like, oh, nuts. But like, I mean, of course we can't require a second ethics class. We can't. But it would be nice.
So to someone who's like never known anything about ethics or had never taken up an ethics course, how would you briefly describe the 3 viewpoints that we talked about in 377?
See, I'm not sure I'd ever say there's anybody who hasn't known anything about ethics, because anybody who's ever asked themselves, what should I do, has some passing familiarity with ethics. But for anybody who is not familiar with a formal study of ethics, what I would say is that there are multiple ways of not just answering the question, what should I do, but asking the question, what should I do? The 3 theories that we study in this class are not the only ways of thinking about ethics, but they are definitely the most influential theories in what might be called the Western tradition. And they have analogs in other traditions as well. For example, virtue ethics, which is the third one I'm going to talk about, has a lot of parallels to Confucianism. So the first way that I'll talk about now of asking what should I do is utilitarianism, and it's the most recent historically, but it's the one that is sort of the prevailing mood of the present. And utilitarianism is specifically interested in saying, in answering the question, what should I do, by saying, how do I create the best possible outcomes for everyone who is going to be affected by whatever it is that I do, right? One of the core commitments of utilitarianism is that every single person is equal. So you're not just saying, how do I do things that work out well for me? This is if you are really civic-minded and really committed to improving the world, or at least not harming the world. And utilitarianism asks you to try to anticipate the outcomes, both the positive and the negative, of whatever it is you're going to do, or whatever it is you might do, for everyone involved. and then say, well, okay, but what if I did something else? And then you assess all the positive and negative outcomes for everyone for that one. And then you do this for all of your possible courses of action. And then you say, okay, well, which of these creates the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest overall balance of benefit as opposed to harm? And this could mean that, all of your options suck and you need to pick the one that sucks least. It could mean that many of your options are good and you need to figure out which one creates the most good. Sometimes it's a matter of trying to figure out, do you want something that benefits a lot of people a little bit, or do you want something that creates enormous benefit for a small group of people? And this one is really appealing to engineers because it sounds objective, right? It sounds like you're tallying and calculating, but you always have to make decisions before you even start. They're perceptual decisions. Who's affected in the first place? What are the kinds of good that we're after? How important are these different goods relative to one another? What kinds of harm? I mean, the thing about utilitarianism is that there's no kind of harm that is categorically unacceptable. Because anything that you might do, you always have to say, well, but what other things are going to happen as well, right? How might this whole picture balance out? But what kinds of harms are more or less significant in your mapping? So that's utilitarianism. It's oriented toward the future. It's about outcomes, and it strives to be kind of impersonal in a good way, in the sense of being equality-minded. Another way of thinking about what should I do is saying, well, what do I owe? What do I owe others, and what do I owe myself in this situation? And it's, and one thing I should say up front is that these two different modes of asking questions, they are modes of asking questions, right? The one that I'm talking about now, deontology, the one that says, what do we owe to each other? A utilitarian and a deontologist could very easily come to the same conclusion about the right thing to do, but they get there by different approaches, right? By different descriptive approaches, different ways of assessing what's going on and what you need to think about when you're making your decision. So a deontologist says, what do I owe others? What are my duties to others involved? And what are their duties to me? A deontologist imagines the world as a network of duty relationships, right? And actually, if you're someone who thinks about the world in terms of right and wrong, then you're probably, there's some deontological bones under that, right? Why is it wrong to steal? Well, because that violates your obligation to the person from whom you're stealing. Is it worse to steal from your mother than from a friend or from a stranger? Well, that depends on how you conceptualize the nature of the duty you have to a stranger versus the nature of your duty to your mother. Now, if you're thinking, well, it depends on what your relationship with your mom is like, that's something deontology is also built for, right? It can seem simplistic at first to students because I say, well, deontology is about doing your duty and following the rules. And people are like, oh, okay, well, that's great. But sometimes it's hard. And then deontology is broken. And that's not true at all. Deontology is built for the fact that it's pretty much impossible to follow all of your duties at once, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you're a parent, right? And you have all these different duties to your child, and your child is like, I'm going to go hang out with these friends. And you're like, I'm a little worried about these friends. They seem like they're, kind of wild and irresponsible, but my child's been so sad and lonely, and now she's making friends. So what do I do? Right? That's an example of a parent having competing duties to their child, right? They're worried about how to balance them, and they can't maybe fulfill all of them perfectly. Or what if you have to punish your child and you know that it's going to send them into depression, but they've done something that really warrants punishment? Like, these are tensions even within the parent's duty to the child. And of course, throw in all of our duties to all the other people in the world, and things get very complicated. And so a deontologist, when trying to figure out what to do, will try to assess, okay, well, how do I honor the most fundamental and relevant duties that I have? I can't honor all of them.
Right.
And I can't just pick and choose the ones that are easy. They all matter. So how do I do the best job possible of honoring the duties that I have and not violating my duties to others? And there's always there's a whole medieval tradition called casuistry, from the Latin word casus, which means case. It's basically case law. It's thinking, what if is it okay to do X? Well, okay, but what if A? But what if B? But what if A and B, but then also C? Okay, but what if A and B, but not C, but instead D, right? Thinking about all these different sets of conditions.
Right.
And all of them assume, right, that the same basic duty relationships are there, but it recognizes the fact that circumstances really change what it means to fulfill your duty to others. And to what extent those duties are the most important or less important given the situation. That's deontology. The third one is, what should I do, is virtue ethics, which is the one that has parallels to the Confucian tradition. And the question of virtue ethics is kind of like, who do I want to be? Who do I want to turn into? The core assumption of virtue ethics is that your personality, personalities aren't static, but they have a pretty strong gravity well that you... In any given situation, what you're going to do is the thing that feels comfortable and easy and natural and the thing that makes sense to you. And some of what that means is that the way you respond to a given situation, your sense of what's possible is going to depend on who you've been historically, right? If you're someone who has always sort of tried to hide in the back and not be seen, and you've always turned away from fights, and suddenly, you're in a class with a friend and the teacher's bullying the friend. If you're someone who's always hidden away, you're not going to stand up to the teacher. It may not even occur to you that that's possible as a thing that you could do because it's so far out of your
it's so
sphere of
ingrained
living.
in the personality.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And now if you are someone who hasn't done that and you think, wow, this teacher's bullying my friend, I would like to be different. You probably can't come into class the next day and stand up to the teacher, but you can start to change the way you live. The word that virtue ethics uses for it is habitus, which means the sort of all the bundle of habits that are you. And that the way that virtue ethics imagines us changing is slowly, right? And through basically through habits, right? Anybody who's ever tried to pick up or shake a habit knows that it takes a long time and it takes practice.
Right.
And, you can go to the gym for 2 weeks straight after spending your life's couch potato. And that's great, but then if you miss a day, maybe you never go back to the gym again, right? Because the habit hasn't really had time to take root. Virtue ethics is basically the theory of ethics that takes account of habit. And it's not really an in-the-moment thing, right? It's not like, here's a scenario, what should you do? What virtue ethics will say about that is well, who are you already? I can tell you what you will do. Virtue ethics is useful for being who do you want to be? And actually, the pandemic is a really useful time for thinking about virtue ethics, right? Because we've totally been yanked out of our normal habitus. We have no sense, I don't want to say no sense of continuity. We don't have a lot of continuity with our lives before. And it's not always clear where those continuities are. It's hard to know how to think. It's hard to know what the future is going to be. It's hard to know what we are preparing ourselves for. But this is a chance to take stock and say, well, who do I want to be? And what parts of my life do I have control over? And how can I choose how to inhabit this moment? Virtue ethics is also the one out of the three that is the most built to acknowledge the kinds of control we don't have, right? A lot of what shapes you as a person is not up to you. It's where you were brought up. It's who brought you up. It's where you go to school. It's do you have to work 2 jobs in order to make it through school, and how early do you have to wake up, and does that mean that you're tired a lot of the time and you have less attention? All of these things shape your habitus. So that's a very potted version of each of those 3. I don't know if you said you wanted it to be short, and I think I failed.
No, I think this was perfect.
It was as short as I could do.
Well, I think the other thing that I found was really interesting is the stuff that we talk about in the course, which is the literature examples that we take up, or the video examples that we see. For example, one of the things that we do in this course is write about one particular story in one particular ethical viewpoint. So let's say first we talk about utilitarianism, and then we have to write a paper about one particular story and how I would basically, it's kind of I think you would be better able to explain it, but it's kind of like a review of the story from the ethical viewpoint that we're discussing, and it's mostly relating to how things happen in that story, what situations happen in the story, and how one particular viewpoint would be good to explain it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be a failure on my part if I could not explain this better than you, since I've taught the course many years and you took it once a year ago. Yeah, so the assignments that you're talking about are called ethical description exercises.
Right.
And the task is to use the theory to describe what is happening in the story. Because spring break landed a week early for this year,
Yeah.
the presentations didn't start till after that. And I thought, well, I just, we'd started prepping them, obviously.
Right.
But I was like, at that point, I was sort of thinking, I wonder which of the stories in this course are going to speak to the present moment, to the sort of these, what will clearly have been the early days of the pandemic, when everyone's sort of new to quarantine, unsure of the future. And when I reread Lacuna Heights for those meetings, I was like, this is it. This is the story that's about right now. That it's about, the question of to what extent is it a moral obligation to be aware of the suffering of others?
Right.
And some of that is about, people who might be ill or dying or just living in really straitened conditions, right? Lots of people are out of work. Lots of people are losing their homes. And then also the invisible network of gig workers who make our lives possible is also, I think, pretty relevant.
That's right. I mean, Lacuna Heights as a story was really I found it really weird because I'm not I really don't like reading at all. Like, I don't read books, I don't read novels. I can watch a TV show X amount of times, but I can't really read. And the story was it was one of those things where I had to read it again and again and again to get a grasp of what each character was doing. So
don't get me wrong, I love TV. I think TV is great. And I say that as a scholar of literature as well as a human being. There's a lot of magnificent storytelling going on in television, but there are specific things you can do in a literary form on the page that you can't do elsewhere. And I think that story is a really good example of it. But those are the same things that make it hard to read.
Yeah. I think one thing that I feel like I was reading up on this and I kind of found this to be really interesting was that when I actually watch a TV show and I actually read the book of the same thing, the difference, one of the big differences that I thought about was if I read the book first, whatever thing I'm imagining is all me. That's how I would have shown that's how I would have imagined the story. But when I actually go in and look at the video or the movie that has has basically been created through the story, it's something that the director or the one who's making the film, it's their imagination of the story and not mine. So I think I think this is why reading a book and then thinking about it or writing about it is more more beneficial for students rather than watching a TV show and then commenting about that.
Yeah. I think what I would say is, there's more interpretive labor involved and that's, it's not a total coincidence that TV is more relaxing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Even the really challenging stories, I think, are more relaxing because that interpretive labor has been done for you.
Right. And I think all of the stories that we discuss throughout the course actually bring up really important questions. And I think at the end of the day, if I wanted to summarize the course in one sentence, it would just be that how to think about questions is the most important thing that I got from this course.
That's good to hear, because I think that makes me really happy. Honestly, I mean, it would be delightful if everyone walked out of the class with a really solid, nuanced grasp of the finer points of deontology and virtue ethics. But in some level, I don't care that much, right? I want people to understand the theories well enough. I always get a couple of papers at the end where someone's like, well, I think deontology is dumb because deontology just says follow the rules and that's not good enough, right? And then I'm like, oh, I failed. But, or, there are any number of times when people dismiss a theory and assume it has nothing to offer because they have misunderstood it. And they think it's really simple, and it's not. And then I feel like, okay, I wish you had understood the theory better. I wish I had more successfully taught this. But all in all, I don't care that much if people have a really precise grasp of the theories. What I want them to understand is the differences in, like, the profound differences in perceptive orientation and moral orientation that are baked into them, right? There's not one way to be a deontologist or one way to be a utilitarian.
Yeah.
But it is the case that there are some kinds of moral absolutes that are available in deontology that aren't available in utilitarianism. And I want students to sort of really feel and inhabit those differences and think, wow, there are a lot of ways to look at the world, and I can take responsibility for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you say about how to think about questions, that is exactly what I hope people take out.
Well, that was good to hear. I think one other thing that was really interesting that happened when I was taking the course was one student, I don't know who it was, but they asked the question about how Thanos might be the most logical of, movie villains of all time, at least sci-fi movies or fiction films.
That is what is seductive about Thanos, yes.
I mean, I could definitely relate to that question, but I don't know how to answer that, because I think Thanos would kind of take up a utilitarian approach to things, right?
I think that the only possible way to make sense of what Thanos does is on utilitarian terms. Right? I mean, there's just, virtue ethics is, for better and for worse, not built to think about those kinds of global, universal questions. What virtue ethics would do is it would look at the people who are lost, and then it would also look at the impact on those who suffer from the loss, right? How incredibly tragic it is, not just for the people who die, but for those who are left behind. I mean, that's sort of what Hawkeye's storyline is about. I feel like it could have been told with a little more nuance, but in any case, that's, and so I think a virtue ethicist would say, no, you don't do this because you're wrecking a generation. Right? You are creating such terrible living conditions that it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for people to flourish, for people to live well.
Right.
A deontologist, I don't think there's any way you can say we're going to destroy half of all sentient beings without, there's no way to square that with duty.
Yeah, with deontology, I don't think we can.
Especially since it seems like it's arbitrary who survives and who does not.
And who dies, yeah.
So utilitarianism is the only possible way to rationalize it. And actually, the way in which utilitarianism might be suited to it is because it's outcomes oriented. You could say, well, those people who vanished, they don't know, they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting question, right? A lot of religions use the language of saying that somebody is in a better place of some kind when they have died. I don't know that Thanos, another way to think about it is they're sort of out of the cycle of pain, right? That's right. More the Buddhist conception. But yeah, if your ethics are entirely future oriented, then when I do this, and people vanish, they vanish from the sphere of those to whom I'm obligated, right? I think we should be suspicious of that. I don't think it's what you'd call good utilitarianism, right? To say, oh, well, we're not going to worry about those people because they're gone anyhow. How can we worry about them anymore? Well, they're gone because of what you did, right? There's a kind of a moral sleight of hand there that's pretty terrible. So yeah, I don't know that I think Thanos is a responsible utilitarian or a good utilitarian. I think that it is possible to use utilitarianism to construct an argument for what he does. I don't think it's possible from any other ethical approach.
One other thing that I wanted to ask you is, what is something about, why do human beings have, why are they so attracted to the idea of having a religion, and how did this thing come up? Because
just a little question to end with. I think life is hard and life is painful, And there are also moments that are beautiful and feel important to us. And there are things that we love that we lose. And having them is good, and losing them is painful. And I think all of that is hard to reconcile with the idea that we're just atoms bouncing around in space. It's possible, but it's hard. I mean, religions can be a lot of things, right? A lot of people like to say, well, you know, Buddhism is more of a philosophy. And what that means is, well, my idea of religion is Christianity, and Buddhism doesn't look a lot like Christianity, so let's call it a philosophy instead of a religion. Some of the religious scholars that I know talk about religion as a worldview. Others talk about it as practices of meaning making, as in whether it's here's a framework to explain why things happen the way they did, or here's a thing that we do once a week or once a month or once a year that accomplishes something, or here's a thing we do once a week or once a year that doesn't accomplish anything for the world but accomplishes something for us as people who live in it. I think the pandemic is a great example of many things, but I mean, one thing that we're all reeling with in different ways is like, what's the fucking point, right? I think a lot of writers I know, and I mean writers in a very broad sense, fiction writers, academic writers, journalists, are struggling with like, what's the point of writing something right now, right? What is that going to do? A lot of our architectures of significance are being destabilized, and that's hard and that's scary. And you know, whether your idea about religion is big dude in the sky with plans, or whether it's like a sense that there's something ordered or just about the universe, or even if it's a sense of like, for some reason I don't feel too inclined to explain, it's important that I don't eat these foods together, or that I do this particular thing once a week, whatever it is, all of those can be stabilizing. There is a really interesting article that I just read, which I'm going to recommend. It's a very long article. It's by Adrian LaFrance, who is one of the editors of The Atlantic, and it's a very long article about QAnon. Are you familiar with QAnon?
No, I'm not.
Okay, that's good, and I'm sorry, I'm about to ruin this for you. QAnon is a conspiracy theory that developed kind of on 4chan, I think, and then moved to 8chan, and it's a pro-Trump conspiracy. It started with this guy posting under the name Q, posing as someone who knew a great deal about sort of administrative and Secret Service intelligence kind of information. Basically, the underlying theory is that a lot of the most powerful people in the world, including, of course, Hillary Clinton, are involved in a massive conspiracy to control the masses. They abuse children. I think they're also everyone's involved in the slave trade. And Donald Trump is part of a campaign to stop it. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of bananas. Anyway, right. This article, it's a really long, interesting study of QAnon, and one of the theses of the article, which I think the author thinks is more dramatic than I think it is, was they're developing into a religion. And it's like, well, no, I mean, as a religion scholar, I'm like, well, no shit. Right, that does not feel new to me, but religion scholars are pretty used to looking at movements that do not identify themselves as religious and saying, well, whether or not you want to call this religion as such, it's doing a lot of the same work that religion does for people. Anyway, so the QAnon article is really interesting. In part, I think anybody who's working in IT needs to think about QAnon in terms of its role in information culture, because I think it's a useful lens on sort of the news, on the sort of the news and information culture, and it's also an interesting lens on the religion question. Do you put links for your podcast?
Yeah, I can definitely include a link to the article.
But this article is free, and it's a really important read.
One other thing that we talk about in the course is about privacy, and it's this constant thing in privacy that privacy is definitely important for someone, but there is a dark side to privacy as well.
Yeah.
And I want to relate this to what has happened in India right now, where in New Delhi there was an Instagram group where 16, 17-year-old boys were part of this group, and they were sharing images and very vulgar comments about some of the girls in their class or in their nearby localities, or just girls that they followed on Instagram.
I wish I could say I was surprised.
There was this screenshot of a Snapchat chat between two people, and it was two boys, and one of them was basically saying that we'll get a few guys and we'll rape this girl who's in our class, and how easy it is to do that. And the other guy was basically saying, no, I'm not interested in this, and he ended the chat and took a screenshot and then uploaded it on social media. Now, what happened was, for some reason, these two stories, the group chat and this screenshot, were kind of coupled together because a lot of the people were kind of like, it somewhat relates to each other, though they're completely different conversations.
Sure. But they're specimens of the same phenomenon, is what
Right.
people are saying. Yeah.
It's just one of those things where I'm not too sure if this amount of privacy is important, or is there some way we can improve the situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's so. I just want to start by saying that it sounds like what is driving this conversation is a sort of an implicit virtue ethics sense, right? That whatever is happening in this group, the problem isn't just, right. I mean, so there was this guy saying, "Let's get together and gang rape this girl,"
Yeah.
which is horrifying, right? But it sounds like the problem, especially in the coupling, is not just that this one particular guy and his friends were thinking about raping this one particular girl. It is emblematic of a sort of a culture of entitlement to girls and their bodies, right? It's
Right.
there's a lack of respect. So this is a virtue ethics concern, in the sense that it's not just that this one guy was going to rape this one girl and that is a bad and harmful act. It's that being in these private chats has created an insulated space for him and for others to think and act in this way without reprimand, without somebody to punish them. And I mean, the thing is that, like, when you say that privacy is important, I agree with you. One of the ways in which privacy is important is that it gives you a space that is insulated from the critiques of the world. And in some ways that is good, because sometimes the world is like, be an asshole. And you're like, I don't want to be an asshole. I want to take a break from that. Or else the world is, I mean, that's a very simplistic way to put it. Or the world is like, only, pussies and fags are gay. And you're like, but I might be gay, right? Like, that you need some space
Right.
to be protected from critique. But of course, being protected from critique means being protected from critique, right? So whatever, like, there's no way to create a private space where people can do things that we think are good that cannot be used for people to do things that we think are bad. One other way to think about it is that, I mean, I'm not saying that the person who screenshotted that chat did the wrong thing.
Right.
But I think that it is worth noting that it is possible that the kid who made this suggestion might not have then actually either planned to do it or might not have actually done it, right? Maybe the
Right.
critique within that insulated space would have... I don't want to come off as trying to apologize for this kid, because I think it's horrifying and he needs this shit knocked out of him at some point. But what I'm trying to say is that he could have knocked it out of himself, right, in the context of that fairly insulated space. One thing that I think about all the time, I am 40. It's not like social media wasn't available in some form when I was younger, right? I was part of bulletin boards when I was in high school, and part of mailing lists when I was in college. it's not quite the same as social media now, right? But it was a social media of a kind. But it wasn't like Facebook or Instagram, right? Or Twitter, where there's this clear chain of evidence where I am this like, basically it was a lot. I mean, it's not that I didn't say stupid shit on the internet. I said plenty of stupid shit on the internet. But it wasn't continuous with my current self in the same way. Because profiles as such did not exist in that same way. And I am great. Like, I look at some of the stupid shit that I see, 19-year-olds saying online, and I think I might have said, like, if not that stupid thing, I might have said something equally stupid and egregious. And the difference is that I didn't have a venue for it, right? Like, even when I was like on this bulletin board or on this listserv to discuss the X-Files, right, and where I said some stupid things, it was still ostensibly, participating in this community that was about how we all loved Agent Scully. It wasn't just like tweet out your thoughts. And so there isn't this record of me being dumb. Like, I got to be dumb in a way that is more private. Right. And I think I learned from some of the ways in which I was dumb, in a way that was scaled to my life. Like, I hurt some people that I cared about, and I regretted that. And, some of them stayed friends and some of them didn't. And I learned from those things, and I became, I think, a better version of myself without everyone watching. Mm-hmm. I mean, the people who knew me watched, but it's not like the entire internet had access to it.
Right.
And so I think that there is something valuable about being a little insulated from this broad scrutiny, not from your community, but from like the world. But on the other hand, it does create conditions for people to do exactly what these boys are doing, right? I think it was during the hearing to confirm Justice Kavanaugh. Mm-hmm. No, it was before that. It was something that Trump was. It was the Access Hollywood video. Do you remember this? Trump was caught saying some horrible shit about a woman he was about to go meet. This was on Access Hollywood. This was behind the scenes footage, and he was talking about how he likes to, grab women and start kissing them before they have a chance to say no. Mm-hmm. This was during the election. And then afterward, people were like, that's just locker room talk. And then one of the responses was like, well, maybe people shouldn't talk like that in locker rooms either. Right. And
well, that's exactly what has happened here. There's definitely these two responses.
Right. I mean, and I think that the other important ingredient in this is power. Right. I mean, transparency. I think transparency can be incredibly important, right? And one of the ways in which it can be important is it can protect those who are silenced and those who are trodden on, right? It's a truism that generally speaking, girls and young women have a lot less power than the boys who are, objectifying them and talking shit about them. Even the ones who don't rape them, though, the thing is, the fact that that's always a possibility is a part of the power dynamic. And so it makes sense to try to lean toward transparency over privacy in a way that favors those girls, that favors anybody who has less power. But I think that one can lean too heavily into transparency, right? I have students who come to class and they say, I don't care about privacy. I have nothing to hide. And I think, well, maybe you don't think you do, but you probably do, and maybe you will later. And if you don't, that actually in a way says less about your virtue and your excellence as a human and more about the fact that your life has not forced you into hiding anything, right? Like if you are gay in a culture that does not accept gay people, or if there's mental illness in your family and you're worried that your future employers wouldn't hire you if they found that out. Mm-hmm. If you grew up really poor in a neighborhood where lots of people have money and you don't want to be ashamed of that, right? There's so many reasons.
Privacy is very important, I feel, in this sense, because definitely, as you said, in India, there's definitely a power difference between the young men and young women. And you can really see that in India because things like this happen all the time.
Yeah.
So I think that way privacy is important. And but from what happened in the group, if you think about it, the whatever images were shared on the group were actually public images.
Yeah. Well, and that's tricky,
So
right?
in that
this is-
sense,
yeah.
in that sense, I mean, what the guys were talking about in the group was could be something that is pretty common and is actually legal, because it's not
Oh, it's
illegal to
definitely
share
legal.
someone's public images on a group chat that's, that has 15, 16 members in it.
Do you remember the story that we read Here and Now? It's about this kid who's using this app it's like a task app, and he's fulfilling bounties.
Yeah.
And so,
I remember that one.
His sort of creepy friend, not really friend, is like, I got this video of girls kissing in a bar, right? And one of the things that's so interesting about that, right, is this video that Lucas has requested. It's not, he didn't, the person who took the video did not like peer through this couple's window and film them in their living room. He filmed two girls kissing in a bar, which is a public place. Anyone could have watched them. And yet, most people talking about that story really feel like taking a video or watching a video is very different than actually being there. Like being in the room and watching them is like maybe a little creepy, but whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Filming it, saving that video, that's really different. And it's the question of what counts as public, I think, is really tricky and really importantly related to privacy.
Right.
I think one of the things that's hard about it too is that, first of all, like I said, there's no way to build any kind of space or technology to afford privacy that can only be used for quote unquote good things and not for bad things. But the other thing is that, the only way to be in a position to make determinations about sort of good versus bad uses of privacy involves some heavy level of surveillance. And who do you want in charge of that? Who do you want making those decisions? I think if there's a rule of thumb we should have, it's transparency among the powerful on behalf of those over whom they have power. Right. I think there should be a lot of transparency in government, a lot of transparency from the police. But in practice, it's almost always going to be the case that people with a lot of money and power can purchase privacy one way or another.
Yeah.
So it's really hard.
The Snapchat screenshot that was actually taken, turns out it was actually the girl that was being talked about was actually the one who created a fake account and texted this thing to some other guy just to see what their thinking is. So it was
a bait and switch.
Right.
It's so interesting because while you were talking about this, I was like, who plans this shit?
Exactly.
And why would they want to gang rape this particular girl? So the supposed aggressor was not actually an aggressor.
Right. It was the girl herself.
Right. Was there some other particular kid who was being impersonated?
I think it could be someone who was like a common character between the guy who was like...
I see. So it
might have been someone known to both of them.
Impersonating. Okay.
Right.
That makes maybe a little more sense, but
Right. I'm not too sure about that.
So this was like a sort of an amateur sting operation.
Could be, yeah. The fact that something like this can happen, and then this wasn't revealed before. Like, this wasn't revealed by definitely the guy who screenshotted the thing and posted it online didn't know about it.
Well, he probably didn't know.
Yeah, he probably didn't know. But then the girl herself who's sharing all of this, even she didn't say anything about it. And
so
all
how
of
did
this
it become
was
public?
Because this thing went to the cybercrime department in India, and then they figure out that this was what was happening. And I think the thing, if you just isolate both of the stories, I think what happened on the Instagram group chat was completely different from what happened in this scenario. And because both of them were coupled together, it became such a big thing.
Yeah. This gets back to why it's important to be as precise as you can in your descriptions, right? Because it's not like, it's totally understandable to me why people would group these together. And if you stop short at just So, like, one thing that happens a lot in class is people will, so one of the kinds of presentations I ask people to do is to talk about technologies that exist in the world right now that are similar to those technologies in the story. And a lot of people will sort of list the similarities. And I'm like, you also got to talk about the differences, right? And that's important too, right? Even the ones that seem obvious, because I think it's important to get in the habit of drawing distinctions and talking about why they matter. It sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is people just being completely under-equipped to have this conversation.
Right.
Well, I'm glad you're doing this podcast, because I know that's part of why you're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, the 377 really helped me on, thinking about things in a different way. And I think that's why this podcast became a reality, because it's about thinking about the things that we're talking about in a different sense from how they're generally portrayed. Like if you ask anyone about this incident that took place, they're basically going to be saying that whatever chat that was happening in the Instagram as well as the Snapchat, both were completely wrong and completely illegal or immoral to do. However, that's not always the case. I mean, personally, what happened with the Instagram thing, it's completely legal to talk about or share images of someone that, the images that are already public.
Right.
But,
and if you just say it's wrong, then it becomes hard to talk about where the problem is, right? I mean, I don't think it's great.
Yeah, it's definitely not great, but it's,
Right. Yeah.
There's certainly more to that than just labeling everything as wrong.
Right. I think that's what a lot of people expect ethics class to be, is learn how to label shit so that you can feel good about yourself. And like, that doesn't help anything.
Yeah. It's more about thinking about these things in a different way.
Well, I admire your follow through in putting this podcast together. I really do.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.